welcome everyone. And you're just watching Carlsen's Insane in the Endgame. So let's even get started. So the first game I'm going to show is between Magnus Carlsen against Alexey Shirov. And that's particularly important when you're just joining the rank of the elite chess players, that is. As Magnus didn't have trainings with Kasparov yet, so this is pre-2010 Kasparov-Carlsen collaboration. So you're going to see how good Carlsen already was at that time. So let's get into this game between Carlsen and Shirov. So we're gonna join from this position. I chose this position for one particular reason. Now, it's not yet the end game. However, Magnus realizing that possibly after Black would get this bishop to e8, I'm gonna get that arrow somehow straight, then Black will get some counter chances. Why? Because once this bishop gets there, let's say here, Black eventually will have a break and these bishops can come alive and provide some sort of play. So Carlsen uses a great psychology in this game because he says, okay, I'm facing Alexey Shirov, Mr. Fire on the board, and in this specific case, it does make sense just to dry up the position. So he takes on d7. He takes d7, knight takes d7, g3, knight f6. And here, Carlsen plays a very, very nice move, following the same vein. So I do wonder if you guys can guess what Magnus played in this position. It can't be too hard, as we're talking about Carlsen's insane endgame. So imagine that you're Carlsen and you're about to take down one of the most exciting players of the 90s. Queen c5. Indeed. So f4 would make sense, as mentioned in chat. But this is the position he's not looking forward to. Carlsen wants a risk-free position where he can lull his legendary opponent to sleep. Queen c5, queen takes c5, and knight takes f6 check. And these are these little twists that grandmasters see and, newcomers miss. They don't necessarily expect like these in-between moves. That little elegant touch makes it such a good move. gf, rook takes c5. So let's just stop here just for a split second. Which side would you take? Obviously, everyone wants to be on the side of Carlsen. However, let's try to be objective for a split second. Which side would you take? Or is there no side to take because the position is balanced? I'll give you one of my takes. And one of my takes is this bishop is just a little bit better than Black's. Black's bishop is actually just firing into the wall, as this pawn structure is fairly solid and it's very hard to crack through. So I see white is better, healthy pawns, more active rooks. Black has a doubled pawn, good observation. And that actually also points out that there's this h6 pawn that can become a potential target. It's not that easy to come near it though. On the other hand, there's one important factor in this position which overrides everything, and that is the fact that there's an opposite colored bishop on the board. Also, as mentioned by chat, it's true, white's king is just way better than black's, because there's no way this bishop will ever be a bother, and this bishop being a bother that is still conceivable. That is, by all means, very conceivable. So the reason there's a high probability of a draw in this position is the fact that there's opposite colored bishops on the board. And if we're kind of wondering about the objective truth here, it must be very close to a draw. However, we shall see that that does not bother Carlsen. Rook a8, king g2. Another small little move, just getting away from the dark squares and coming a bit closer to the center. Bishop d6, rook c2. So, because of this doubled pawns, Shirov decided to play f5. And that's a good move, putting these pawns on white squares. However, it does limit the scope of this bishop, and it does stop any sort of expansion with e4, f4, and e5. f5, bishop c4, a4. So it's just making sure that all of these pawns are fixed on black and dark squares, and maybe he could potentially attack them. But already, in this position, we should take a look and try to find a potential target in black's position. Look and think about loose pawns. Where could you find some loose pawns in black's position that potentially we could attack in the future? a4, b7, c6, h6. So it's very hard to get to this h6 pawn. At least it'll take lots of time to get close to this guy. However, this a pawn, whoever said the a pawn is actually the culprit. It's still very hard to get to the b and c pawn. However, the targets will be on the queen side. So if we note that these pawns will be the potential targets, where does this bishop on c4 belong to? And just a side note, sometimes using this thinking, identifying the target, and then devising a plan actually help you to play the best possible move in the position. So is that bishop to d1? Okay, so we want to get this bishop to c2 to target the pawn. Okay, makes sense. But what if we want to attack the b7, c6 pawns? Well, for that, we need to go to e2 and f3, yes. And that's exactly what Magnus played. Bishop e2. Now, when you guys said bishop c2 or bishop d1, he actually has that in mind. So when he plays bishop e2, says, I don't know, Shirov, what is your plan exactly? However, I can go bishop d1 if the time is right. Once I move this rook c4, hit this pawn, and bishop d1, attack there. Let's say as bishop e7 played. Let's say if this happens here, I'm just going to mark a bit of time. And now bishop d1, and white actually wins a pawn and gets some winning chances. But the greatness of bishop e2 is the fact that it's flexible. Not only does it threaten to get the bishop on the long diagonal, it also threatens to go to d1 and threaten the a1, a4 pawn, that is. Or bishop f3 and put pressure there. Bishop e7, bishop f3. Now, another psychological little detail that I have to mention. So Shirov loves to calculate, but calculation in chess takes time. So he often got himself into big time troubles, as happened in this game as well. So The reason Carlsen plays bishop f3 and not rook c1, king g7, and rook c4, because then it would be abundantly clear that he is going for the a4 pawn. So black would just double up on the a file, double up on the a file, and just hold still. So what Magnus does is he plays an enigmatic move and says, hey, I'm not going to tell you if I actually have a real plan here. Your move, sir. Decide what you want. Bishop f3, rook a5, rook c4. And these moves are actually kind of frustrating, because by in itself, rook c4 doesn't accomplish much, because it only puts pressure alone on the a4 pawn. This bishop is staring into nothingness, at least for the moment. Bishop f6, and now he plays rook c1, kind of hinting at bishop d1. And here, black makes a terrible mistake, which is not bad, like it's not a losing move. However, I think it was a bit too risky. And in this specific position, because of the opposite colors, black should have just stood still with king g7, and if bishop d1, just rook a8, and wait for white to actually come up with something. However, Shirov played e5. And without actually going into deep variations, do you guys have any ideas why this move could be a problem long terms? Tsubakara, actually you're not wrong. I do think so, that Shirov might be even trying to win still. So what is the downside of this pawn push? Well, it doesn't really block the bishop. In fact, it's trying to open it up and just put some pressure on b2. So this e5 pawn actually attacks this guy. So after some exchanges, the bishop gets stronger. However, after this exchanges, let's just compare these two structures. This structure to this one. This was still a structure that was fairly solid. All of those pawns were defending each other. After this exchange, these f-pawns are sort of isolated. Both the f-pawn, the h-pawn, and the a-pawn can become a potential target in the future. So, even though this is an aggressive setup and might give some faint hope of a win for Shirov, it does create more problems than those pluses that he just got. So now black is attacking our pawn. So how can we be both aggressive and defensive at the same time? Can you guess what Carlsen played in this specific position? Indeed, rook b4 is a very strong move by Carlsen, not only defending the b2 pawn, but targeting the b7 pawn, and if you ever move the b pawn, my bishop is just ready to snipe down the c6 pawn. Another little bit of a tidbit, if this rook ever gets to b7, there's a plan of rerouting this bishop to c4, and there will be more problems in the upcoming future for black. It would lead to a long defensive struggle. So rook d7, if you go with the other rook, as mentioned by chat, rook c5 can show up. If bishop d6, there's rook d4, and suddenly black will get an extremely passive position with a terrible rook compared to these very active pieces. You can't really take mine because your d8 rook is hanging. Rook b4. Rook d2, you win one pawn, but you lose the b7 one, and I will get my eyes on that c4, through that c4 square to the f7 pawn. So that's why rook d2 was avoided. Rook d7, rook c2. Just over defending, a little move, but making sure that Shirov has no clear counterplay. King g7. And here, Carlsen does what every grandmaster would do, bring the king in, because that is the strongest piece on the board. King f1, bishop f6, just waiting around. However, Carlsen realized it is time for some action. How can we put some pressure on black's position? Yes. Rook c4. Just attack the pawn. Sometimes chess is simple. Can't really play b5 because the c6 is falling. And not really. The problem is not that there's rook takes a4. The problem is the following. Takes, bishop takes b2, and rook a7 is the problem. Why? Because not only I put pressure on b7, but I even set up some bishop takes c6 tactics. So if you would go, let's say, just back to bishop e5, trying to kick out this rook, white does have bishop takes c6, and if rook d1, king e2, hitting this rook and still threatening to take on b7. So there's lots of pressure going on after rook a7, and once this pawn is marched up to a6, there'll be problems. White will get an extra pawn and many good winning chances. Rook c4, rook a8. But again, Magnus says, hey, I can take on a4 anytime I like. So I'm just going to go rook f4 and probe you a little bit. Just ask you an extra question before I actually get into the details. Rook a5. Yes, he can always take on a4. He's bringing in the king. Rook c5, trying to exchange. Rook c4, takes, bishop b2, rook a4. And I think here Shirov showed the signs that he is almost going all out. So he played c5, which is very dangerous because a move before, black still had kind of a solid structure. After c5, not only does Carlsen get a target on a7, he will also get some white squares. Because no longer does black have b5 counter moves in the position. c5. Now rook a7 is not played just yet because there's c4 and the c pawn can be very fast. Also a side note, takes. This endgame is still drawn because just one pawn advantage in an opposite colored position is usually a draw. So Carlsen plays king f1. And I think this is the moment where Shirov makes a big mistake. Can you guess the right move in this position for Shirov? Not the wrong one, of course. So always think about concepts. When Black decided to play c5, that was actually a sign that he's about ready to play active chess. So he definitely, as some of you mentioned, should have played b5 and hope to activate the c-pawn. And probably this would have provided enough chances to hold the game. However, b6 was played, but that's just by no means part of that idea. It just doesn't really work. Why would you play c5 with the idea of going down the board and then just play b6? That is a sign of hesitation by Shirov. b6, but this gives us the option for a typical plan that we were dreaming of earlier on already. So let's get ready for a Magnus maneuver. His idea with b6, exactly my question as well. What is the point of b6? Probably trying to remove these pawns from danger. However, it lets go of these white squares. Well, the bishop isn't doing too much on b5. However, it would do a great deal on c4. That's why Magnus played bishop e2. Because the bishop is going this direction, and as I said before, if somehow the rook could get on the 7th rank and put pressure on the f7 pawn, then there would be real winning chances. Also note that this bishop has 0 target. The a pawn is the only target left, but if this is exchanged for the b6 pawn, it is clear that it's only white who can hope to win the game. Bishop c3, bishop b5 was played, rook d1, king g2, bishop a5. So you can see that Shirov knows that. He can't let Magnus get behind it. Rook f4, king g6. And the next move is very important and typical to an opposite colored bishop game. Let's try to be safe here. a4, indeed. You want to make sure that pawn is defended, and because Carlsen has a firm control over that c4 square, there's no way that Shirov can create a passer. And if he cannot really create that passer, then there's no way that Shirov can do anything. Bishop c3. And even though white already has a kind of a pleasant position, he still does have this idea of g4, which is important for one reason. Black had weaknesses, but it kind of was holding together. The bishop can't really go to d3 yet because this rook is taking control of these crucial squares, and the rook can't really get behind this f-pawn, so there's not enough room to break through. However, after this move of g4, Magnus opens up the position and creates a target on f7. F takes g4. And here's the big move by Carlsen. Bishop e8. Not even interested by the g-pawn because that's not as important as the f-pawn. If you manage to get the f-pawn, then you will create a pass pawn of that e1. Bishop e8, and there's no way you can defend it. Rook d7 is controlled by the bishop. So the f-pawn is falling, and suddenly there are more and more problems to solve for Shirov. Yes, the position is probably still balanced, but Shirov has to walk the tightrope. Bishop e5, bishop f7, king g5. If king g7 attacking, then white could just go rook f5 and eventually not only your king will be in danger, but I will have this e-pawn running down the board. So it is quite clear that Shirov is in somewhat of a trouble. So plays king g5. However, king g5 has one big downside. Can anybody tell me what is the big downside of this move of king g5? What if bishop f6 instead? So if you go bishop f6 here, I can take on g4. And if bishop g5, you run into h4 ideas. And if you move the king, I can check again, and the f-pawn will be very loose. So that's why he decided to go king g5 instead. Well, Shirov is a fantastic and imaginative player. However, this is not his type of opposite color bishop ending, because this time he has to defend. So the main issue in this position is, for Shirov, is his king. His king is not too safe. And because of the opposite colored ending, there's no defense on light squares. So bringing this king up to g5 was actually a dangerous move. Maybe even an inaccuracy, because there's just so many white squares around this king. It is possible that Carlsen is going to be able to use that to his advantage. So he plays rook e4, puts pressure on the bishop and the pawn. King f5, rook c4. And these are, again, those little tweaks that some of us miss. Rook e4 wasn't really trying to attack that bishop. The point was to lure this king to f5. Because anytime the bishop will attack this g4 pawn, it either will threaten a check or threaten a check from behind, winning some extra time. Rook d7, bishop h5. And that's the main issue. Now, Shirov is forced to move all his pieces back just to defend that g-pawn. Mind you, if you lose this g-pawn, I have two connected pass pawns, which usually win the game. Also stopping h5, correct. Rook g7. And now, Carlsen plays a move that is very much Alexey style. Let's try to find a move that's much in the spirit of Alexey. Or Alyochin, whichever way you prefer to say his name. a5, exactly. Why is this Alyochin or Alexey style? Because Alexey's favorite idea was to play on both sides of the board, kind of outstretching the opponent and just putting too much or a lot of pressure on his opponent's pieces. Now, it's getting a lot to handle for Shirov. Not only does he have to defend the g4 pawn, he also has to deal with some threats on the side. ba, rook takes c5, rook a7, rook c4. Again, you can't really start running with the pawn because you just lose the g4 pawn. And one of the beauty of the opposite colored endings, that you can just drop back to a2, even though you thought that a pawn is just going to be fast. No, it's not. It's not fast enough, and these two connected pawns are likely to just win the game. It is scary. The a pawn is super scary. However, it's just not fast enough. So Shirov is forced to move to g7, back, rook c5, rook a7, rook c4, rook g7. Game proclaimed a draw, and this was a brilliant performance by Carlsen. Not really. In fact, he was just playing with Shirov, who was probably already in time trouble, and played rook c6. Mind you, if he would have played rook c5, black could claim a draw, because that would be 3-time repetition. Rook c6, rook a7, bishop g6, king g5 check. No, it's not a draw. I'm just joking. King g5. But again, the problem is, it seems like this a pawn is going to promote. However, the king, the big issue. So let's try to find the key move in this position for Magnus Carlsen. h4, I think I can still capture that pawn. So don't look for magic, create magic. So we already know that this king is a little bit dicey over there. We need to do a little bit of pressure on that king, and then we'll be close. We'll be close. So he played bishop c2. Point being, he wants to corner this king. And when the king is cornered, there are just so many mating concepts that you can use there. a4, rook g6 check, king h5. And again, here comes that little twist that makes Magnus such a great player. Rook e6. He gives a check first. He might have wanted to play rook e6 immediately. However, he makes sure that this king is misplaced, and then he attacks that bishop. And now he's setting up bishop g6 ideas. Bishop g7 played. But here, probably bishop b8 would have been the only move. But again, let's be fair with Shirov. This does not look natural, not at all pretty. And even though this could maybe hold the draw, it's still kind of an unpleasant position to play as black. However, bishop g7 was already a decisive mistake, and it is white to move and win. How do they find these moves in pressure? So they notice that the king wouldn't be as ideal on h5. I go back a little bit. So they notice that, hey, I want to get rid of this bishop. However, I'd prefer this king to be on h5 where I could check it. And that's how they find it. They use logic and calculation, of course. The big move is king g3. And if black plays king g5, that wouldn't really end well because of what, dear viewers? If you check, the king can still go back. There's something more radical in this position. Namely, white is going to checkmate. Rook g6, just king h5. h4 check, gh, f4, and bishop g6 mate. Now, for some of you, just letting you know, that's not the only way to mate. Bishop d1, even though a little bit odd looking, it's still kind of a nice little checkmate from d1. So here, instead, he played rook a5. However, he still met his demise. So just, let's find our little checkmate here. It's actually pretty cute. You're happy with mating your opponent with a pawn? Wow. Okay, bishop g6, king g5, and here Shirov actually resigned because there's abundance of pawn mates in the position. So I would say this is the more stylish one, gh, and f4, checkmate. And it's funny, but even in endgames you can checkmate your opponent because the bishop is covering those squares. That square is covered by the rook, and the king is controlling all the other important squares. So this was actually a very nice little demonstration by Carlsen that with slow and steady pressure can actually break super grandmasters. So I really think that this was pretty cool to see how he actually does it, with inching ever closer to victory, putting pressure on the position in each and every case. So I do want to show one more game from Biel where he faced none other than Alexander Onischuk. We're going to start off from this position. Now this is still in the middle game, but one of the things that super grandmasters and sometimes even grandmasters do is that they envisage the ending that they're hoping for. So he knew that this is a possibility and said, hey, an ending will be perfect. So he played d5, just trying to close this bishop in. So white's play is going to revolve around aggressive knight play and playing against those fairly passive bishops. After d5, note that this bishop doesn't really have a scope. C takes d5, queen takes d5, knight b6, and here comes the invitation for the endgame. But it's an invitation that it's kind of tough to refuse. So the problem for black is the following. Not only does this bishop have no targets, because there's a big fat pawn on e5 just blocking the view, but the fact that this bishop on c8 just doesn't really have a life purpose. It kind of has like a middle game crisis going on with that bishop. So black really needs to do something about it. Queen takes c5, knight takes c5, and here Onischuk actually comes up with a good solution for that middle game crisis. And he goes bishop g4. It's a very clever move by Onischuk. He's saying, hey, take my pawn, I don't mind, but in exchange I'll get to activate both of my bishops. I put pressure on this knight and that bishop. So hooray, this will be great. And if you go knight d4, I have bishop takes d4. You have no choice but to take on g4. If you take on d4, there's bishop e2 and you lose a piece. So white is forced to take, bishop takes b2. And because of the opposite colored nature of this position, compared to the other one, this is more likely to end in a draw. So, seeing this, obviously, Magnus says, no, thank you. I'm not gonna eat that pawn on b7. That's not to my taste. So if you can compare the quality of this g7 bishop or that g4 bishop, which one would be rather like to capture as white. The white squared bishop, of course, because this bishop at the moment is still rather useless. It can't even capture there because that pawn is blocking the view. However, this bishop is kind of annoying. And noticing that that bishop is just being kind of a nuisance for white. How can we get rid of it? Yeah, just play h3. Ask where it's going. And if Alexey Onischuk would take on f3, there would be bishop takes f3 and that pawn would fall. Now you might be asking, what about e4? But if you play e4, I take here, bishop g7. Note that I already won one pawn, and after bishop takes b7, it will be 2. So white will be up a pawn, and with an extra pawn, definitely white is the one to be favored. So yet again, Onischuk goes for rook c8, counterattacking. If h takes g4, rook takes c5, and because there is no entry to the d7 square, black is doing fine. However, the situation has changed drastically, and now Carlsen does take on b7. What changed? Well, the fact is, in this case, the bishop on g4 is under attack, so that'll be the difference. There's no more e4 because just hg, ef, bishop f3, and white is just up a pawn. Bishop e6, and the next move by Carlsen is just very stylish. Let's try to find that one. Also, it's fearless, which makes it even more appealing. I wouldn't call e4 fearless, especially there's nothing to fear after e4. Not that it's necessarily a bad move, however, Carlsen's a bit better. Okay, much better. So the main issue white is facing is the wrath of these bishops. Once e4 happens, both of those guys and snipers are going to just fire down the board. So Carlsen had to be ready for that to happen. So he went b3, saying, actually I'm not scared of e4, because whenever you play e4, you give away this fantastic square for my knight, which is protected by that charger pawn, which electrifies and charges this knight. And this bishop actually can't really pass through that. You've got to exchange it, and if you exchange a pawn down, that's actually favoring the side which has an extra pawn. So b3, it is true, b3 not only stops any threats on the A and B pawns, it also takes away jumps and important squares from this knight and bishop on e6. So b3's main point was to just take away squares and restrict these bishops. Rook c2, activating the rook, putting pressure on this bishop and the pawn. Bishop f1. Cold-blooded, not panicking, not at all, saying, okay, you've got one guy attacking that a2 pawn, not a problem, I have that under control. If you play e4, it's even better because I'm also attacking the rook and the knight and the bishop with the knight, and that just gives a very good position for white. extra pawn, no clear compensation. Even though this rook is still active, it's not enough for a pawn. So knight d5 was played. And here comes Magnus with the best way of converting. So when you have an extra pawn, what are you supposed to do? What are you guys' thoughts? What you should be aiming for when you have that extra pawn? So chat mentions knight d6 ideas, but whenever you already have sort of a winning advantage, or at least those are winning advantages when you have an extra pawn in the GM level. So you don't just want to suppress your opponent's counterplay. You really want to simplify. Exactly. Zboryagis points it out. You want to exchange pieces, because at the end of the day we will have an extra pawn and then we'll just be prevailing due to that. Bishop c4. Obviously calculated to the T, putting pressure, and would be extremely happy to exchange off one of those bishops. Because at the moment, Onischuk has the bishop pair and the hope to use it as a compensation. Knight c3. Let's try to guess the next move. This one's important because whenever you're making exchanges, you've got to be sure you're doing it in the right way. And rook d2 was played here. And you might think the easiest part is to win a winning position. Not at all. That's the hardest part. Rook c1 is actually super dangerous. You're inviting knight e2 trickery. Now it doesn't really work yet, because bishop takes c4, we have this in between move of rook takes c3. However, we do leave the a2 pawn on pre, and that's not a great thing. So not wanting to lose a winning position, he played rook d2, eliminating that rook, avoiding tricks like this knight e2 fork, and also keeping this exchange operation alive. Rook takes d2, knight takes d2, e4. Very good move by Onischuk. He's trying to activate this bishop. Also, he is hinting at this tricky little idea of knight e2 check. Here, takes, and normally you'd get two pieces for the rook, but in this specific case, there's f takes e6, and you're suffering. Actually, it's black who's better now. So seeing these tactics coming from a mile away, he plays king f1. Not only sidestepping that trick of knight e2, also bringing in the king. So it does serve a dual purpose. Rook b8, knight c5. So every move by Carlsen has a purpose. Not only does he remove this knight from that attack, he also puts pressure on the e6 bishop and that e4 pawn. Bishop takes c4, knight takes c4, and what is magical, and this is high-level chess, you'd anticipate some tactics to work here, but it just does not, because Carlsen calculated it and knew that, okay, that is just on the surface. It looks dangerous, however, it is not as bad as it looks. Rook b5, knight a6. Another tricky little move, and funnily enough, this rook just is running out of space. You can't attack this rook because my knight is controlling those squares, and you can't really go to the c file because the A knight is holding and controlling those important b4 c5 squares. And that is surprising because that knight on a6 just doesn't look that good. It usually is kind of awful on the side of the board. But in this specific case, it actually works and is kind of powerful. Bishop f8, and the next move is just brilliant by Carlsen. So pause the video, or if you're here just watching, take a look, try to solve this one, because Magnus's next move is out of this world. It's very pretty. A move probably completely overlooked by Onischuk. As I mentioned before, this rook on b5 is on shaky grounds. If you can use that fact, you might be able to mobilize the A and B pawns, which is the key for victory in this type of position. If you go a4, I do take that pawn. It's a very wild idea, however, it's a little bit flawed. b4, exactly. And the point is, if you just let me roll with a4, b5, you are lost, because there's no way you're going to ever stop those pawns from rushing down the board. So Onischuk had to take. Now, at the moment, everything's safe. White doesn't have a control of the b file, so you can't use this idea. Also, the knight is defending that rook. However, there's a4. Just kicking this rook out from this comfortable position, and once this rook moves, it's no longer defended. Rook b7, rook c1. The idea being that there's this threat of knight takes b4. If you take on a4, there is rook b1, and you lose the game because the bishop can't move, the rook is hanging, and the bishop has no more defenders. So once this knight was forced to move, as if you don't move it, there's knight takes b4, rook takes b4, and rook takes c3, and you're just a piece down. You get into this problem of not being able to do anything, because once this rook moved, all of the other pieces got unstable. Knight d5 and back. And this time, the main issue is you don't have this counter trick of rook c7, because yes, after knight b4 you can take this knight. However, after rook c4 there's knight takes d5 and you're just losing. So play f5 instead, a5. And even though white gave back that one pawn, Onischuk just landed up in an eternal pin. Can't do anything about it. King g7, and here comes the decisive maneuver. Let's try to find that, because that is the clincher. The icing on the cake. So remember, black's main issue is this pin, so we might want to milk that idea. You never really want to move this knight because it is actually pinning this rook to b7, so it can't really move. If we can put extra pressure on b4, this will be a gorgeous position for white. Therefore, Carlsen figured, how about I get my knight to c6, have a double attack on b4, and 3 against 2 is usually a winner in a chess game. So therefore he played knight e5. Now, Onischuk still tried to muddy waters, but ef, e3, takes, king g1. He had no choice but to go knight d5, and as I mentioned before, it is never too late to mess up a beautiful game. Knight c6 would run into bishop c5 check, and you would lose the rook and probably even the game. However, Carlsen is vigilant, plays king h1, no more bishop c5 trickery, and who's gonna stop knight c6, knight b4? Onischuk tried rook b5, but after knight c6, he gave up, as there is no way of stopping white from taking the b4 bishop. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this two splendid Magnus Carlsen endgames, which he showed that with constant pressure, eventually you can win very balanced endgames. I hope you had a fun time. Take care.